if what sciences are is the final, what I've got a science in my hands, and what I've got in my hands is a set of rules which I use to analyze and study the world. There's never a set of rules for the whole world, right? There's sets of rules for many different parts of the world, but then there's no science of sciences that would actually integrate all of these. That's why he mentions Kant and Kant's attempt to have a hierarchy of sciences. And now what's super interesting about that too is one of those books that is Hayek basically criticizing Kant's project in economics. So he basically says he had this project that he called the use and abuse of reason. And he thought that a lot of the 19th century social scientists basically had this vision: we're going to build a science of humanity and then maximize the well-being of that humanity based on this science, right? But what fails is that knowledge, and this is Hayek's main insight or main contribution, is that knowledge is distributed. All of those different secrets are all over the place in the world. So any genuine science is going to have many different islands which directly, in terms of their rules, don't know how to communicate with each other. So the integrative function between all of those things cannot be another science. So you cannot have a general knowledge of the whole, right? But you can have the whole interacting with each other in a higher vision, in a sense, which is what Sophia's role plays here.
Yeah. Welcome to Grail Country. My guest today is Marcus Schirra. We're here to continue our conversation on Bulgakov's philosophy of economy. Marcus is an assistant professor of economics at Eastern University and also writes and makes videos on the Econ Playground. So welcome back, Marcus. I think you had a little, do you want to do a little summary of our previous episode before we dive into the...
Yeah, so one of the most interesting things about the previous section, so the chapters 1 through 3 that we read last time, is the way that he focuses and defines the topic of economics. So in a standard economics textbook, you'll probably see a definition that's something like, economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources, scarce meaning limited, or limited relative to our potential purposes for them, right? So I've got some money, I have a bunch of things I want to buy, I have to only buy so many of them, right? That's decent enough definition, right? But the way that he focuses it is he says it's the study of labor, or that concept, that's the central concept that economics is working with, this concept of labor, right? And but the way that he defines labor is much more expansive than you might see in even classical economics.
Yes.
In that what he means by labor is some living being, like a human being or even an animal to some degree, he goes into a little bit, right? Sort of struggling for the maintenance of their life or their being in the face of death, or in the face of I shouldn't say so much death, but yet unliving matter. Right? Or yet unliving forces outside of them, right? So the earth, the trees, trees are in between maybe a little bit, or other things are things which, with my labor, I'm maintaining my life by interacting with these things, right? And that's essentially what economics focuses on. So what he defines labor as is the act of life struggling against death, or struggling against the forces which are counter to life in some sense. But I was thinking, especially while reading these chapters.
Let's not forget, though, it's very important. He very, very quickly makes a turn to demonstrate that death ultimately is in the service of life, which is going to be important with some of the moves he's going to make in the material that we're about to discuss.
Yes, but so I shouldn't say that death is counter to life, but there still is a struggle. Right?
Yes,
the struggle is part of the process that life is ultimately.
In our current condition, there is a struggle.
Yes, yeah. So I was thinking while reading these chapters that focusing on, or using a term that is not, it's not that he doesn't use it because it's a translation, but if we said that economics is the study of creation, it makes much more concrete this larger sense of labor that he's using, and the idea that even the act of creation of the whole world itself is God's act of labor, and then the analogy between God's act of labor and our acts of labor.
Yeah, and I think that's good. That's good because particularly in this section, there's a huge emphasis on the sub-creative capacity of human beings and how that plays into how we should understand economy and science. in this section. So
yeah.
that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
All right. So that's kind of a summary of where we left off. So he begins chapter 4. Before anything else, he talks about the transcendental subject as the proper subject of economy.
Mm-hmm.
And he is wanting to define the transcendental subject in a way that is definitely distinct from Kant. And he's very critical of Kant in this chapter, and basically accuses Kant of solipsism by reducing the transcendental subject to the individual. He makes it so that really the existence of the other is drawn into serious question. So he instead goes about talking about the transcendental subject as humanity as a whole, rather than as the individual. So that's the way he's different. I have a quote here. This is from page 125 and 126 of the translation that we're reading, by Catherine Usia. Yeah, right. The single transcendental subject of economic activity, the personification of pure economy, is not any given individual, but humanity as a whole. Economy should be impossible and incomprehensible if we did not acknowledge the existence of such a transcendental subject, bringing unity to the many separate acts that make up economic process. Mm-hmm. So, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, and he starts it off also with talking about Aristotle talking about studying something as more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah. That's that's exactly one of the critiques he makes of Kant, is that he's lost his. He needs to refer back to his Aristotle. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, correct.
So he doesn't want to refer back to Aristotle, I guess. But the point is that in studying anything, you can't define it by just any one of the elements, I guess, that you're studying, but you have to be studying the whole pattern of how these things interact with each other, right? Yeah. So at minimum, to describe the behavior of this atom, you're interested in studying that atom relative to other atoms, right? So in that minimum sense, there has to be some sense in which you're studying the whole system of atoms instead of just studying a single atom.
Yeah, he also says that the system actually has to pre-exist the individual acts that occur within the system, mm-hmm. In order for the acts to even occur at all.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's a big metaphysics thing, but that I'm not too aware of. But yeah.
well, okay. So it has to do with what the motivation for action is at all. So essentially, if I were to summarize the way he's approaching the idea of the transcendental subject and kind of contrast it with Kant, Bulgakov is asking about the transcendental subject not in terms of how do we know anything to begin with, which is essentially how Kant begins his questioning. Bulgakov is saying, how do we act to begin with? Mm-hmm. So he's actually putting acting in the world to be primary, and actually our knowing is actually a product of our activity in the world.
So then by doing what he does later in that putting knowledge acts as a subset of acts, he's answering Kant's question by answering that initial question.
Exactly right.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I guess what Kant is trying to do is provide that unity, that necessary unity to the subject by referring to an individual mind. The individual mind is the thing which does the unification. Right. But in making that move, he alienates the self from the other. Right. And he prevents any kind of meaningful action.
Yeah. But Bulgakov is a Christian thinker, unless we think that he's suggesting some sort of absorption of individuals into a mere super individual with nothing that separates them. He clarifies that. He says this on page 141 through 142. I've got some ellipses in here, but it's sort of to just make it shorter to read. Mm-hmm. Humanity in its unity is nonetheless made up of many separate individuals. The harmony of individuals in free love and active unity is a source of particular happiness for each participant. So it doesn't actually like the unity of the transcendental subject is not stand in contradiction with the existence of separate individual persons. So he's not denying that individuals exist, but he's saying that the proper subject of economy is humanity as a whole.
Yeah. So this is the reason that I'm really interested in this, and other economists would be really interested in this, especially people from broadly my Austrian economics tradition, right? Which is there's this marriage, or there's this sort of triumph in the history of economic thought related to what's sometimes called methodological individualism. Mm-hmm. In that when we make descriptions of the economy, we always have to be referring to the actions of individuals, right? And so certain interpretations end up thinking this is exactly the kind of thing that Bulgakov is writing against, right? But there's many things to be said for methodological individualism in which it helps add some clarity to things, right? So one of the best, yeah, go ahead.
Bulgakov, here's what I would say about Bulgakov. Where Bulgakov would say it would be a problem is when you lose sight of the fact that it's a method.
Exactly, yeah.
And absolutize it. That's when he says, as long as you're conscious of the fact that it's a method, then I don't think you would have a problem with it.
Yes, and basically realizing this is making me realize that all of the problems that I've had with other people talking about methodological individualism is because they're not only using it as a method, they're doing metaphysical individualism or Kantianism or something like that.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Which is sometimes is literally what they're doing, but it's not necessary. So, like a good example would be the public choice tradition thinks of themselves as methodological individualists, in that a lot of the study of government was previously something like, well, the government should do this, or there's a problem, there's a failure in the market in this place, so we should have the government do this. And so what the public choice theorists go, well, the government is a ton of politicians and bureaucrats and laborers and citizens all interacting in various ways that produces this final product called the law, and then the way in which it's enforced. Right?
Yeah, the fact that it's not in direct conflict is, if it's not absolutized, and that is pretty clear from the fact that Bulgakov, when he's talking about the subject who's acting in the economy in what we would call a Sophianic way, he refers to as proprietor.
Yeah, that was interesting that he uses that term.
Because he wants to use that term because it's because a proprietor is also a caretaker.
Uh-huh.
And so, like, his goal is to, as much as is possible, within using economics and the philosophy of economy as a tool, is to use it to do as much as we can to restore the economy to an Edenic or Sophianic state. And one of the things that is indicative of that is that it is a caretaking activity as opposed to one that's only geared toward competition and domination,
or even just to focus on the individual consumption, right?
Correct. Exactly right. It's oriented toward communion rather than consumption. Exactly right.
Right. Well, but the point is to say that methodological individualism has analytical value, in that once you break open once you don't treat the government as a single large atom and as many interacting atoms, you understand the government better. Or so typically we call this in theory breaking open the black box. So government is this black box that just behaves in certain ways, and when you crack it open and look inside, you can see why it's moving in different ways. And to some degree, that's what methodological individualism is breaking it up so that you can understand it better. But he'll talk about that more in the next chapter, about the limits of that.
Right.
But that's not to say that a lot of the genuine increases of value in economic sciences have not come from doing that individualizing move when you're analyzing. Right.
Yeah. So then after the discussion of the transcendental subject as the proper subject of economy, he then moves into the Sophianic economy.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just, this is a quote from that section. Through her, he takes in and reflects in nature the wise rays of the divine logos. Through him, nature becomes Sophic. Human creativity is really a recreation of that which pre-exists in the metaphysical world. It is a recreation through work. That's on page 145 through 146. So essentially what he's saying is that all creative labor, at least potentially, participates in divine wisdom, and that the goal of economy should be to make it so that economy, in as much as possible, is participating in divine wisdom as opposed to pursuing mere utility.
Right. So this concept, the Sophia concept, is probably what he's most well known for in theology.
Is what he's most well known for.
Yeah, it's what he's most well known for and most controversial for, I think.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So I don't have strong canonical opinions about it or whatever. But it's interesting in the sense that what I understand its role is in he makes an analogy between Sophia and then what Plato calls the realm of ideas or something like that.
Yes.
Right? So science, since it's only focused, and this is more in the next chapter really, science, since it's only focused on these parts, he says that's like someone inside Plato's cave trying to figure out things based on the shadows on the wall, right? But someone who is in some way referring to Sophia is necessary, or referring to some kind of higher form is necessary to understand how things relate as a whole.
Right. Well, another way to think, I mean, one of the ways to think in terms of Sophia that might like ground it a little bit more specifically in the way he's talking about here in terms of the economy is that, first of all, Sophia is related to the intelligibility of the possibility of the intelligibility of the world at all is given through Sophia. In fact, like if there are no metaphysical prototypes of the world, there's no reason for us to think that the world is intelligible. And so the very fact of the intelligibility of the world is a sign of the operation of Sophia. But one of the ways to but he also talks about like the moral aspects here. So one of the other ways to think about it is to think about it in terms of things as they ought to be versus things as they are. Because that's definitely real for us. Like we all have this perception of like things are not as they should be. Something is amiss. That things really ought to be this way. And so the idea of moving the economy in a sophic direction can be reduced to a concept as simple as to restoring creation to the way it ought to be as opposed to the way it is. So it's essentially it's the movement. And I mean, there's no way for me not to bring the church into this, because I think the church has a role to play in this, because that's kind of like it's the gradual movement of the fallen creation toward the kingdom of God. Like that's the and we actually are under a moral obligation to pursue that. Even though we know that within our finite limited capacity we won't achieve that end, we're still obligated to aim for it.
I guess through its slow conquest, or I shouldn't say slow, through its conquest of the kingdom of darkness.
Correct.
Right. It's slowly integrating those things in. Yeah. But then what he does make sure to be clear about is, since us as potential conduit, so he refers to our man godhood here. Yes. When we are creating something out of matter and referring to Sophia or wisdom in order to better inform that matter, right? This is when we're doing that best. That's our man godhood. That's us
in Christ,
reflecting the image of the Creator, right? Yeah. But those moments, those labor act moments, are exactly also the fulcrum in which sin comes in, right?
That's right.
So we can pull, and even if we are accessing some part of
and by the way, it depends on which world you're actually which world you're seeing. So in as much as your vision is actually properly aligned to the image of Sophia, then your acts of subcreation are going to reflect that. And in so much as they are tainted by the world of shadows and illusion, of the fallen creation, then they're actually going to act against it, even if that's not your intention.
Mm-hmm. But what he does is he says that even though we do not create Sophia and we do not create any matter, right? There's still an original contribution of each human. That's the subcreation.
Yes.
Right.
And also, by the way, like this idea of subcreation, and this is where you can see this is kind of important here, because he talks about Eden and the fall in this section too, and it's pretty clear from what he says that economy, as Bulgakov conceives it, is present even in Eden. Like there is like man has a job, a role. It's a priestly function, right? And the work is liturgy. Mm-hmm. And so even in the Edenic state, there's still labor. Mm-hmm. The labor is the liturgical labor of priests, and actually, this is important to what you said earlier about the struggle in life between life and death in the earlier section, because the essential nature of that function is to bring everything that is sub-personal and not yet quite actively participating in the divine image into it.
Mm-hmm. So, and that's in the act of Eucharist. You're bringing the elements into something, then you give them up to God, and then they come back.
Exactly right.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So I think, because even in Eden, not everything yet was personified.
Yes.
Right. There were still animals in Eden, and Adam named the animals, but he would have done more than that with the animals if he hadn't fallen.
There's unnamed animals out there that Adam didn't get to.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. But with someone like Satan, what he's saying is that it's possible even for someone to have access to or knowledge of a part of Sophia, but then mistake their role in the process.
Well,
right?
And also, and also for most of us, that's probably what we can expect.
Right.
Right.
Or in a sense, maybe we take a piece of wisdom that's a gift from God, treat it as something that we generated on our own, and then create something that's good, and we see that it's good, but then think that we are the source of that. So by not giving it up,
essentially by making it a product of our own will instead of a cooperation with the divine will. That's the pattern of how it becomes corrupted. Regardless of the specifics of the matter, no matter how good something is in the beginning, what causes it to become corrupted is when it starts pursuing my will be done instead of thy will be done.
Yeah.
Then no matter how good the intentions it starts from, or how clear the vision it starts from, it will become corrupted.
Yes, but what this got me to realize... It
may even be the right thing at the wrong time, by the way. It may not even actually be inherently wrong. It just might be the right thing at the wrong time that you're pressing to do before it is the will of providence to accomplish. Yeah.
Time is one of the dimensions in which goodness is defined or something.
Well, time is actually time, and Bulgakov actually says this. I remember this in the text because it's something I've been thinking a lot about lately. But Bulgakov actually specifically links the fall to the advent of time. Like so
that might not be in here.
It is actually. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can hunt it down. Hold on a second.
Is it where he talks about Maximus? Because that's kind of a maxim.
Yeah, it is near that. Yes, it is not. It's not exactly there, but let's see.
Yeah. Well, okay. While you're saying that, I was going to say that, and I mentioned this to you before. That
you talk while I search for it.
Yeah. The concept of Sophia became more concrete to me, or it made sense to me when I made that analogy to Tolkien's Silmarillion. The first section of the Silmarillion that many people are familiar with is called the Ainulindalë. So people hear the story, and I'd encourage you to, because it's very short. So just go and look it up and figure out what it's about. It's relatively short, but people know. In Tolkien, God creates the angels, and then the angels sing the world into being. Right, that's the way they hear it. But the actual details of how it goes forth is there's this story. God creates the angels, and then he gives these symphonies to the angels, which they sing, and then he shows them what they created with their symphony, which is not the world itself, but a vision of the world. Right, and then he takes a subset of those angels, he calls the Valar, sends them down to use that wisdom in a sense to craft the world. But also Melkor, basically the devil Satan character, out of his own conceit, thinks that he can fashion the world in a greater way, right? So the relationship between that initial wisdom or that initial vision and then the actual labor of creating that vision are not the same thing, but the vision is necessary for the creation in a sense. So even when we are participating in creation and bringing it forth and further into life, to the extent that we're doing that properly, always has to refer to the initial vision in a sense. But when we misstep and sin and go X, Y, Z, that can still be corrected. It's a very complicated vision, So yeah.
Okay, so I found it. Okay. Let's see. The current stage, this might have been from one of the earlier chapters. The current stage of struggle between entropic and organizing forces is comprehensible only as a violation of Sophia's primordial unity, in which the metaphysical center of being becomes displaced and a general illness of being results. This decentralization results in the world's being plunged into the process of becoming, of subjection to time. So the very fact of this of us being in a state of becoming and subject to time and death is all product of the fallen cosmos.
Yes.
So yeah. So I didn't hallucinate it. It's there.
Yes. Yeah. You're right. Yeah. But I think that might be from chapter 3 or something. But yeah.
I think that might be chapter 3. So I might have been reading something that echoed back to that for me, and so I conflated which chapter it was in.
No, yeah, but it makes sense, and that's those big Maximus themes too.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Oh no! Here it is. No, this is in chapter 4.
Oh, okay.
He's even more explicit here. The metaphysical fall is a major hypothesis for the philosophy of economy. Of course, this was not an event in time, and we would search in vain for its traces in the annal of history or in paleontological. It is in chapter 4.
Okay.
So cool. It is in chapter 4.
Yes, and so I guess he quotes also from Proverbs or Wisdom of Solomon.
Yeah, it's from he quotes from both. He quotes from Proverbs and then from Wisdom of Solomon.
Yeah, in this character, the personified character of wisdom, right? Yes. Saying, "I was with God during the creation," in some way, right?
Correct.
So that, and from my understanding, that's the controversial part is like exactly how much is wisdom personified or should be or something. But
I mean, in terms of the formal theology of it, like Bulgakov lays this out in his book that's called Sophia, the Wisdom of God, which is his actual like formal defense of the orthodoxy of his theology. And he is very clear in that text that Sophia is not an hypostasis. So what he says is that, like, although she's talked about in personified language, he's not positing that's just the poetic language that Scripture uses. Is that a personification? But the reason he's very specific about why Sophia is not a hypostasis. She's not a hypostasis because Sophia properly belongs to all three persons. And so you can't divorce Sophia from any of the persons. So it's actually the Usia of God that Sophia is associated with. And
would it be the Usia, or would it be one of the energies if you're working with that?
I don't know Palamas well enough to talk about the energies or anything. I don't feel qualified to talk about the energies or the essence energy distinction. I know that I think Bulgakov definitely says it's Usia. He doesn't shy away from that. So that also makes it a controversial claim.
Yeah.
Because Orthodox are very conservative about making statements about the essence of God. But we have scriptural warrant for Bulgakov's argument is there are certain things that we can say about the essence of God because we have scriptural warrant for saying it. So we can ascribe wisdom, love, and glory to the essence of God because Scripture tells us that they are ascribable to the essence of God. And so Sophia is wisdom, love, glory. Right.
That's even that kind of thing is in Dionysius. In his initial discussion on that stuff, he's like, well, the scripture says, we think we can't say anything about God, but scripture says God is love, God is wisdom, or blah, blah, blah. So that's
he doesn't say anything that is beyond what we have scriptural warrant to say.
Yes.
So it's like he would never posit that we can say anything about the essence of God through discursive reasoning or theology, but we can talk about what's been revealed to us about the essence of God through the scriptures themselves. Yeah. That's his argument.
Yes. Okay.
So, sidetrack, but I guess it's important since we are talking about what he means by Sophia.
No, okay. So, now what related to that though, speaking about revealing, the one of the ways that he talks about labor and nature here is something like and this is this sort of theme that I've found in this book and that I've found in other places and that I want to keep working with, is this question and answer dynamic, right? Mm-hmm. I mentioned it in the last video. Right, the question and answer dynamic. So in some ways, he says somewhere that nature reveals its secrets to us through the labor process. So we confront some cold, dark mechanism in front of us that we then, through our labor, translate into life. And through that translation, we are somehow revealing something about nature that we didn't know before, or we're discovering something through our active labor. So through labor, there's also a knowledge production, right? But in my understanding, the material or the actual arena of action presents us with the question, and then Sophia's role is to provide the answer, right? So when we're confronted with a situation where we go, what should I do here? Or something's amiss, or I feel something's off, right? That'll generate some sort of anxiety until you have an answer. It doesn't need to be crippling anxiety, but just the basic, what am I gonna have a question, right? That's a miniature anxiety, right? Or discomfort, or the way that Mises calls it is that he says all of action. This is one of the Kantian, basically, economists, right? Says all action is put forward through disease, right? Like you're not at ease, so you're impelled to move forward. So that disease basically presents a question of how should I act? And Bulgakov's point is to say, to understand how the subject and object relate to each other, you have to have this prior vision that integrates the whole, right? And so that's how Sophia is actually a necessary part of the role in the answer, is the idea.
Yes, but that vision kind of only happens via embodied action through participation. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's because he would not want to encourage a state of pure contemplation before acting in the world. That would not be what he's saying at all.
Right.
In fact, I think that would be kind of like, he would view that as sort of like a Kantian kind of problem, like wanting to, like putting knowledge before action.
Right.
And actually, the problem with putting knowledge before action is that you're avoiding both judgment and participation in doing that.
Well, so, it's the action. Part of that problem is solved when you think that the way that he thinks of knowledge is each act of knowledge is itself an action, right?
Yes.
So when you're thinking, when you're genuinely thinking, you're engaging with the world, and you have a feedback with it and a conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely, 100%.
So yeah,
absolutely correct. Well, so this is a good transition, I think, to go ahead and move into chapter 5, where he talks about.
Let me say one quick thing first, because I had a note, because I've also been reading Xenophon's Oeconomicus. Right?
Okay.
Which, if you read a history of economics thing, people will have a one-line throwaway thing to like, there's this book called The Economist by Xenophon, and it's a Socratic dialogue. That's like the first book of economics or something like that, right? And they just dismiss it. So I've been reading it. It's not that long, but one of the interesting things about it is when he's talking about the management of a household. Right, because that's the. This
is what Bulgakov's talking. That's great.
Yeah, but
which is why he talks about the world as a household. This is also why he uses that language of proprietor that I referenced earlier. Right.
Yes.
He's talking about the proprietor because he's wanting us to view economy as the management of our shared household, which is the household of God.
Yes. But so the conversation between Socrates and the different characters is basically, hey, I want to be a better manager of my household, right? How do I do that? And one of the things that comes up is what they call calling on heaven, right? To like answer their questions about how to do things, but also, to give them rain and et cetera, things like that. So there's large chapters about like you and your wife, right? Or he goes like, oh, you know, if my farm is not doing well or my property is not doing well, is that my fault or my wife's fault? Right. And they go through like, oh, well, he's like, it depends on like if she's trained or not. But one of the things they say is it depends on if she's praying to the gods or not. Right. Mm-hmm. So in some extent, they're recognizing in a pagan way that there is something greater than just some sort of inbuilt human nature that you're accessing when you're answering questions.
That's really good. Yeah.
But it's not a full universal integrative thing, right? It's just within one household. So you have the God of your household, let's say, right? Instead of the God of the world as household. Oh, wow.
Right.
The world as household.
Yeah, that's right. That's the yeah, exactly. That's why I was like, you got my attention there.
Yes, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we can go into the next chapter, the nature of science.
Yeah, let's talk about that. And I'll go ahead and let you had some ideas on that. So
okay, yeah. So the way that he first, so I found this chapter really interesting too, because he goes even more into talking about Bergson and the American pragmatists, who Bergson not as much, but the American pragmatists have been a huge influence on me over the years, right? Particularly William James, but also more recently Charles Peirce. And so all of the ways that he's talking about them here, the positives and negatives, I see where he's coming from, right? But what he's able to do is he talks about what knowledge is, or what the pragmatists are often doing is they're recontextualizing knowledge, or the decision to believe or not, right, is not a abstract reflective cognitive thing like I have nature and then I just need to find the right thought that perfectly matches that nature, in the sense that that nature is a mirror image of what's going on in my mind. I need to make my mind an image of what's going on outside. Knowledge occurs because we're confronted with basically our life ending, right? So we're in the practical situation first. So the pragmatics comes first, and then knowledge is one of our many tools to try to solve these situations. So one line that he has in the second section is that in all of our labor acts, we have a tool in one hand and the flaming torch of knowledge in the other, right? So the light of knowledge, in some sense, or the clarity that knowledge brings, is one of the means by which we have better labor acts, such that we better integrate dead things into life, right? So that's the basic idea. So that the way that he thinks about science then is, and it's so interesting the way that science is talked about in economics today, because science for a long time was thought of as something that moves along on its own track in a sense, and then economics borrows things from science. So the relevance of science for economic activity has been understood for a very, very long time, right? But treating science as a subset of economics fundamentally is a different thing, or a different act. And so the American pragmatists were really strong at this, or really interested in this, such that Charles Peirce, when he was trying to describe the pragmatic philosophy, one of the metaphors that he used was, he said something like, think of yourself as an insurance company, right? That's trying to understand the world better in order to give yourself a better policy, or figure out what belief to bet on, or something like that, right? I'll talk more about that later, but anyway. That's the basics of this chapter. Is if we think of science or knowledge,
right? So if science is a tool to create. Let's talk about it this way, and I think Bulgakov talks about it pretty close to this language in the chapter too. So essentially, science is a tool that we use to create the best model of the world that we can. But the purpose of us needing to create a model of the world in the first place is essentially an economic purpose. That's why we need a model. If we didn't have the function of economy, we wouldn't actually have the need to create models. So science is inherently in the service of economy because it's its raison d'etre.
Yes. So it's not as if there's a contemplative aspect of life and then an economic aspect of life, right? The contemplative or the scientific aspect of life is a part of that basic labor function, right? Yep. Or that basic struggle of life against that. Yeah.
Yep.
And but so it's so cool in this chapter how fast he goes between like knowledge is the greatest, like knowledge is everything, or knowledge is like an integral part of everything you're doing, but also is extremely hesitant, or like has all these warning signs on it. Right. So one of the limits of science is that it can only, and I don't know exactly how to think about this, it can only understand things in their multiplicity. That's one way that he talks about it. So in order to figure something out, you have to cut it up in a sense to understand it in its parts, and then you maybe get a small piece of knowledge, or maybe you might think of a laboratory as cutting up nature into parts, bringing them into the laboratory to study them in isolation, right? And
which is why capital T truth is elusive to it, because capital T truth is primarily interested in the unitive.
Yes, and the whole. So you'd have to be able to take the whole universe, put it in your laboratory, and do tests on it, right? Which is not possible, right? Yeah. So science is always focused on parts by its nature, since we are ourselves parts. We can't.
Which he doesn't have a problem with. The problem that he has is when science loses sight of that reality.
Yeah.
And then begins to claim more for itself than it ought to.
Yes. So in this just came to me. In economics, this is the relationship between what we call partial and general equilibrium, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I peeked a little bit into the next section, and he basically goes into this, which is where I was anticipating he goes. In that partial equilibrium is like, I can give you, generally, I know that, as the price of bread increases, less people want to purchase bread, but also as the price of bread increases, more people want to sell bread. Right? So I can build you the basic supply and demand model and say that the price should be the equilibrium price such that the equal number of people want to buy and sell bread, right? That's a partial equilibrium story, right? So if I take those parts of the world and understand them in isolation, I can see a pattern going on there. General equilibrium is an attempt to understand how all markets are part of the same system. So we need a theory that explains every single price in the economy all at once.
Yeah.
Right? Which in itself is impossible, right? That would be the totalitarian vision that fails. So as we might want to make a more complicated model where these different objects are related to each other, but if we genuinely believe that we have an accurate general equilibrium model of the entire economy, we're necessarily missing something, because we ourselves as analyzers are part of that economy that we're analyzing.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Yeah, that's good. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you that came up to me as I was reading chapter 5 is Bulgakov's stance towards science is interesting, because it seems to me, and I was trying to find a quote from the text that, but I couldn't find the one I was looking for that reinforced this. But you can tell me if I'm off course. But the impression that I got from reading this section is that while science might have these tendencies to go astray in certain directions, that science is essentially in the service of Sophia and part of the process by which the cosmos is being restored, at least in potential, potentially. So then that raises a lot of interesting contemporary questions that are confronting us in our day. The first one of which that comes to mind is AI, because that question of if science and technology can be subjected to Sophia, then it seems that these are things that could be put in service of humanity and toward the unification of man and nature into a Sophianic unity. But the potential for it doing quite the opposite is also obviously there. Yeah. So then the question becomes one of orientation. This was I was thinking back on the conversation I had with Paul Kingsworth when I had him on my channel, and I'm very sympathetic to a lot of Kingsnorth's vision. I think he's definitely diagnosing a very real problem that is a tendency in the way that we tend to think about the world. But I don't feel he seems to think that it's inevitable for science and technology to feed those patterns in a way that I don't think is necessarily true. And that if we change our orientation toward those things, then it opens up new horizons of possibility. What do you have anything to say about any of that? Well, and also, do you think I'm extrapolating correctly from the text? Do you think
Bulgakov
would say, okay?
The mere fact that someone can think that AI is a technology that can get out of hand, and such that it dictates our decisions rather than us using it to genuinely enhance life in the service of Sophia, right? That is the warning sign that he's putting on science, right? But I guess it would have to be, so the way that I understood what he finds possibly science gone awry is the moments in which people forget while they're doing science that what they're doing is generating a set of rules or concepts or abstractions which are to be used in aid of something else, right? So when people forget what AI is doing, right? Because it's of course very impressive, right? Yeah. What it can achieve. So when people forget that what AI is doing is taking a bunch of parts and finding a rule, like or a larger pattern in all of those parts, right? And then that pattern is how we are better able to act in the world, right? And instead thinks that what the AI is doing is characterizing the world, and it's now defining the world with the patterns that it finds, right? Then we fall into the trap, right? Yeah. So with science in general, Newton found these laws of gravity based on the observations of the planets and stuff like that, right? So he has a set of laws, and then when one actually thinks that those laws or those mechanisms are what reality is, then that means that you think that the kingdom of death is what the world fundamentally is, right? And you actually forget about the life which initially inspired that model or that vision, right? So the one thing that I thought was interesting is that what science's product is, we say science achieves something when it generates a concept or a rule or a theory, which in simple terms generalizes to many different things, right? So it can seem like it is a more fundamental thing, but it's actually superficial. It's superficial, but it's true in that it's useful. So that's why he talked about the pragmatist so much, in that science is still true. Mathematics, even though it's based on axioms that we're deciding to believe in, is still useful because it helps us achieve these other goals, right? That's the sense in which science is an achievement. But we should fail in thinking that that achievement is only useful because we actually characterize the fundamentals of reality better, right? What reality is it's a whole vision acting in a certain way and basically waking up.
This chapter raised a whole bunch of questions for me. I don't necessarily have a lot of answers, but one thing I did do is I did jot some notes down of I called it toward a Sophianic science. So I'm trying to use the framework that Bulgakov was working with here. I tried to decide what I thought the traits of a truly Sophianic science would look like. And I was kind of hearkening back a little bit to the conversation I had a long, long time ago with Dr. Vervaeke and Michael Barton about Goethe's approach to science. Because I think Goethe's approach to science and some of the work that John Milbeck has done about alternative modernities kind of give me hope that things kind of ended up in a direction that they did, but there wasn't an inevitability to it. The things could have gone differently, and science could have progressed differently. So that leaves that as an open possibility. But here's the notes I wrote. It would recognize humanity as an organ of the world's self-consciousness. They would understand knowing and making as spiritual liturgical acts. It would treat empirical investigation as a mode of divine contemplation, rather than as a complete end unto itself that is fully sufficient. And thereby, this would heal the rift between mechanism and meaning. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that a science like this wouldn't really abolish empirical rigor, but it would transform it and move it toward a higher purpose. But it would have to acknowledge the existence of those higher purposes.
All right,
I think that would be the barrier.
One, maybe, I don't know if this would be another point or would go one of the other points that I'd add, is that the science can never become totalitarian in the sense that in that you will never have one theory which characterizes all of reality, which is exactly what he says, in that there's a reason why, and I found this super interesting too, because he's using economics to understand science. There's a reason why, and he basically gives a theory of why science also benefits from the division of labor, which is in The Wealth of Nations, which is up here. right? Which is
Right.
also in The Wealth of Nations, in that you have to break up reality to
Well,
understand
that's also
it better.
right, and I think that's actually reflected in the nature of Sophia too, right? Because it's like Sophia is like it is like, I think you compared it to the realm of ideas, right? So it's like Sophia itself is inherently, it's a multi-unity, you know. So on the one hand, it is comparable to something like the Platonic notion of the one, but it is also simultaneously the unity of all individual things at the same time.
So I guess what he's saying is that if what sciences are is the final, what I've got a science in my hands, and what I've got in my hands is a set of rules which I use to analyze and study the world. There's never a set of rules for the whole world, right? There's sets of rules for many different parts of the world, but then there's no science of sciences that would actually integrate all of these. That's why he mentions Kant and Kant's attempt to have a hierarchy of sciences. And now what's super interesting about that too is one of those books that is Hayek basically criticizing Kant's project in economics. So he basically says he had this project that he called The Use and Abuse of Reason. And he thought that a lot of the 19th century social scientists basically had this vision: we're going to build a science of humanity and then maximize the well-being of that humanity based on this science, right? But what fails is that knowledge, and this is Hayek's main insight or main contribution, is that knowledge is distributed. All of those different secrets are all over the place in the world. So any genuine science is going to have many different islands which directly, in terms of their rules, don't know how to communicate with each other. So the integrative function between all of those things cannot be another science. So you cannot have a general knowledge of the whole, right? But you can have the whole interacting with each other in a higher vision, in a sense, which is what Sophia's role plays here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's what I found really interesting that I want to be using in my own work, is that what he said is what science values, what makes a science a better science, is if that science is more consistent, right? The fewer exceptions there are to any law, the better we've made our science in some sense, right? Or the more exceptions we can explain by other laws, right? The more consistent as a whole this science is, and the more it helps me out, instead of just like vague notions, right? Or vague regularities, right? If I have a precise law like Newton's law of gravity that actually helps me predict exactly when that ball is going to fall, right? Then this science is better. But there's a limit to that, right? So the idea that we can have a consistent set of laws that characterizes everything, that's science's conceit that we ought to sort of push against, is the idea.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that here's the question. That's an interesting question. So is a comprehensive theory of everything just inherently beyond the boundaries of what science is capable of? And is there someplace other than science where we can look for that kind of unitive understanding?
Yeah, I think that's at least Bulgakov's point, is that the unity is in something like a vision like Sophia, or in God holding the whole world together in some sense, if you don't want to refer to the concept of Sophia.
Right.
So therefore, there's sciences for many parts of the world which are in themselves useful, but there's no science for the whole, because Sophia as a whole is not a set of rules.
I think you could just say the divine. You can say the divine ideas if you don't want to say Sophia, and you're basically going to be saying the same thing.
Yeah.
So,
So in economics, and I'm guessing this is where he's going to go next, is in economics, the conceit here is the idea of a unified social science, or like a social physics, which describes the movements of every single individual in totality. And so he refers to someone like Jeremy Bentham here, who had very much that kind of mindset, and that there's a social determinism to the whole grand system here.
Yeah, actually, that's one. I think maybe we'll save that, because I believe that the next section does get into freedom and necessity a bit.
Yeah.
So actually, but even in this section, like, the concept of freedom actually plays an important role in his understanding of the way in which Sophianic action in the world is accomplished. It's essentially Sophianic action in the world is accomplished through freedom and creativity, and is not determined.
I see. Yeah.
So
there's so this is a paper that a friend of mine wrote, and we're working on some sequel papers, is basically applying the concept in economics. We have this concept of institutions, which is rules under which people act, which at least to some degree regularizes their behavior, right? So we have the rules of the road. When I'm driving on the road with you, I want the other people to be acting more regular, such that when I go on the road, it's much easier for me to not die, basically, literally.
Right.
So so we can have the same thing in that to the degree that this society is ordered, it's following rules. And so a social science based on these institutions, or understanding these institutions, helps us understand the patterns or the regularities or the mechanics, in a sense, of this society. But the point that we bring up in the paper is that no set of rules for any society is going to characterize or describe exactly how every single person should be acting in every situation. Right. So in those moments, there's some sort of free deliberation over what will I do and what will other people's do in this situation. And what we say is that what we call the general answer is ideas, or that's the kind of thing that people are contemplating or referring to when they want to solve those situations. So
well, actually, one of the functions of Christ's parables in the gospel is actually to throw people out of that notion that there is a single set of rules that will universally apply. And also, that's also some of the more challenging books of scripture. It's that's one of the things that's being questioned in Job. It's no, you can't explain reality by a universal law of karma. There are things that happen that are not explained by a universal law of karma, and the book of Job puts that directly in your face. So there's a way in which the scriptures that we have through Revelation are actually already pointing us away from making that exact mistake. They're showing us that that no set of rules is ever completely sufficient on its own, and there always has to be the openness to the movement of the Spirit. Right. In my very Pentecostal way of putting it.
Right. But so these tensions in Bulgakov, and that does he like science or does he not like science, if we put it very crudely, is the same kind of tension in Christ when he talks about coming to fulfill the law, not abolish the law. But as you're saying, the point of the parables is to provide higher principles that are not themselves rules.
What spirit is the science in service of, I think, is really the question. That we need to be asking, right? And actually, one of the things I said earlier, it's okay, is this science in service of my will be done or thy will be done? Am I trying to make it so that things are on earth as much like they are in heaven as possible, or am I trying to make things more convenient for myself? And to enhance my own power?
And that's where we can be more skeptical, at least of parts of the AI industry, in that people talk about AI as if this is going to be the greatest instance of human self-empowerment, right? So it is in service of my will, but also the service of just the goodness of this AI machine, right? This thing in itself is glorifying, right? So we ought to enhance it or send resources to it or something like that.
You were at Midwestern, right, Marcus?
No, I was at Northwestern.
You were at Northwestern. Okay. So Vervaeke was quite openly questioning. He basically at Midwestern, he warned people away from using LLMs specifically. It wasn't a universal warning against all forms of AI that exist now or may exist in the future, but it was specifically directed toward LLMs. And his warning was based on two factors. One of them was we don't scientifically understand how it works. We figured it out as an engineering problem, but we don't scientifically understand how it's functioning, and that's inherently dangerous, right? And then his other thing is that we think that we're using it as a tool, but it is also manipulating and using us, and that is an inherently dangerous interaction. And then the third thing that he said was that it encourages you to treat it like a person, But in the process of encouraging you to treat it like a person, it actually degrades the way you interact with real people because you don't really treat it like a person, right? In a proper way. So it's kind of like it's like preconditioning you to interact badly with actual persons in your interactions with people. Yeah. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that there's a video that I sent you that you should check out after this.
Yes.
It's a paper that I'm working on applying some of that paper that I talked to you about earlier to the way that churches function, right? Yeah. And I've been really interested in the way that Vanderklay has been talking about Vervaeke in that moment, and that he's been calling him a fundamentalist or whatever.
Yeah, you know? Yeah.
So what I thought that fundamentalist strategy of Vervaeke, it's not really so much of more of what you'd think of as a Bible bashing fundamentalist, right? And that you say, these are the rules. I have shown you clearly that AI is wrong and that you should not use it. So I think that Paul was actually wrong to say a fundamentalist in that instance. What Vervaeke's strategy is more of a monastic-like strategy.
Yes,
in that the world inherently full of death is out to get you, right? And if you just walk naively into it, you're going to be caught in the snares of sin and all of these kinds of things, right?
And the fact that we don't understand it is really key to his trepidation.
Yes. There's a lot of uncertainty in this environment.
Yeah.
So what Vervaeke is doing by isolating himself is what I'd characterize as like an insurance policy on wisdom, right? In that, maybe using AI is gonna get us the next Plato or something. Who knows? Or it's the next Galileo, like the telescope or something, right? But given that there's so much uncertainty, if we put all our eggs in the AI basket, we could lose wisdom entirely. Now, I guess I have a faith that that's not going to happen. But Vervaeke's monastic commitment might be the reason that it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Right. So that and what this is basically what the rest of my historical research was really trying to explain why what monasticism is, or the role of monasticism, only works when only some people do it. So that's why what Vervaeke is doing is not a fundamentalist commitment, it's a monastic commitment, in that he is putting himself in a position where he's giving up the material benefits of the AI for his.
That's right. And I don't think Vervaeke is delusional enough to think that like what he says is going to have any impact on, say, for example, your students decide to use AI in the work they're turning out for your classes. Of course. Yeah. And it's not going to stop them.
Yeah.
And so.
But then again, Anthony the Great didn't think he was going to have that much of an influence, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So
that's another interesting question about it is like, well, like it does seem to have a certain inevitability to it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any past pattern that we can look at that suggests like, we realized this technology was just too dangerous, and so we decided to let it go and not pursue it. Like we can decide that a technology is like too expensive or too inefficient, or there are lots of other things, but there are lots of other criteria by which we will decide to stop pursuing the technology, but this is too dangerous, or we don't understand it enough. I don't see any instance in history where that's ever stopped us.
We've definitely at least had that conversation with nuclear weapons, right?
Yes, and then we did it anyway.
Yeah, or well, I mean, the question is more, can we isolate the weapon part from the a lot of energy part, right? Yeah. And that seems to be difficult to do, but we'd do that if we could, right?
Right.
And I would say that nuclear non-proliferation, right? Those treaties have had some binding effect. It's not perfect, but there are forces in that direction. But whether or not you're right that it's inevitable that the forces against for the beneficialness of the technology is always going to move in that direction, I'm not sure. I'm agnostic about that.
Well, well, that's the thing. If it is inevitable, then that again means that like the question before us, if it's inevitable, is how do we subvert this technology, right? Mm-hmm. So I would say the internet has been a sort of a mixed bag technologically. It's given a lot of good and a lot of bad along with it. But like one of the things about the community that we participate in, TLC, is essentially it's a community that is attempted to turn like some of the primary functions of the internet against itself,
Mm-hmm.
And to use it for completely other purposes than it was intended. And so while we may not be able to stop, we may not be able to stop the bad uses of AI. The question is that if we can't stop the bad uses of AI, should we be standing in? I don't have any problem for anybody who wants to take a monastic stance toward it for personal reasons, like for Vervaeke, that's fine. But then, do we need to have other people that are willing to try to find the subverted positive uses for it, to use it against itself?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, no. So the point of most of my research was that monasticism was a response to politics entering into the church through Constantine. Right? So if you think of Constantine as an analogy for AI, then what I basically would argue is that those people who do try to go in and work with Constantine for the better of the church, work through the political process for the better of the church, are only going to operate properly if there are people doing that monastic thing.
Gotcha.
Right? So they work together. They're complements to one another. Right.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
I had a couple other. I had one thought.
Go ahead.
That I wanted to mention too is he has this great line right towards the end of the last chapter where he says that science is mistaken if it thinks that it's the origins of thoughts, right?
Right.
But he does say that what science is science is the accountant for thought.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So in a sense, we might have all this money flowing in and out of our business, but if no one's counting it, then we can't make a good use of it. Right? So what science is doing is it's providing a system. Now I'm saying this out loud. I'm doubting the analogy is perfect, but what science is doing is it's generating these rules or concepts to help organize all of this thing that's in flux in front of us. So that's the cash value added. That's how science makes our labor more effective, in that we can now categorize and understand that part of nature that we're working with better and thus get more out of it, right? So science's role is analogous to the role of accounting in a business, what our labor is, and what science is to labor, what accounting is to a business, right? But what that means is that from an economist's perspective now, I can start to think, is there a science itself takes an amount of labor, just like you need to spend some time hiring an accountant or doing the accounting yourself in a business, right? So is that time or is that labor focused just on science or just on accounting justified based on the value that it provides to the business? And that value is going to shift based on what industry you're in or what you're doing. So essentially I'm saying, what are the determinants of the demand for accounting, and thus what are the determinants of the demand for science? So under what conditions would we now say we're going to spend more time focusing on science because it'll help our labor out in different ways? So some theories, just one, for example, is the rise of the Industrial Revolution or the rise of the invention of new machinery to aid in the production of labor came from the fact that in Britain in the late 18th century, wages were really high. So if you were going to run a business, a large portion of your costs were hiring workers. So inventing a machine that makes each worker more productive or means you don't have to hire as many workers is going to be much more profitable. So it's more worth your time to invest in creating machinery or inventions, right? So that's one theory of why science rises, or the Industrial Revolution rises at the time that it does. So can we generalize that? I'm interested in figuring that out.
Yeah, well, I think that, maybe it's just my mind. So I want to apply that same kind of thinking to the scientific and economic problem that faces us. Let's go back to the AI conversation for a moment, because I think and I think as an economist, this is a very relevant question for you. It's like, with the reality of AI, assuming that I'm right and we're going to continue pursuing it inevitably, that is going to have a tremendous impact on human labor. So then the question is well, one of the things that's good about what Bulgakov's definition of labor is sufficiently broad that even if AI were to take over most of the important areas of economic productivity, there's still some meaningful labor that remains for human beings in Bulgakov's conception of labor.
Yeah, but notice when you used economics there was the narrow sense.
What was that?
The way that you use the word economic productivity there is the narrower sense.
Right.
So I'd say maybe something like agricultural productivity.
Right. So, well, that's right. And I asked it in the narrower sense for a reason, because my question is like, well, do we need to develop a broader sense in order to address the problem? Like, maybe we need to make a move like Bulgakov and broaden our understanding of both the economy and labor in order to make room for human beings in the world that's coming.
Mm-hmm.
Or what other possible solutions are there?
Yeah. If someone finds their contribution to resuscitating nature, the fact that they pack boxes in a factory, but now AI means that they don't need to do that anymore, do they now believe that they are thrown out of what makes their life meaningful? Or do we have to figure out something else for them to do? Right. That's a good question. Yeah. I mean, humans have adjusted that if I don't have farming, what am I going to do? Well, we've adjusted to that. And I'm relatively optimistic that we'll be able to adjust in the future. But recognizing the problem now makes the answer easier later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I mean, it seems to me that there's going to be a lot of pain and suffering in the short run until we figure out. It seems like
I wouldn't be.
It seems like the urgency. It seems like the urgency of figuring out some kind of at least framework is pretty high.
Yeah. And I'm not sure that it's interesting because I'm not sure that the urgency would be there if there wasn't this sense that there's an arms race involved and that it has military applications.
Right.
Yeah. And in the national conversation, when someone questions, should we be subsidizing or reorienting infrastructure for AI, the response is always, well, we got to do it faster than them.
The Chinese. Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that always, exactly. So it always ends up getting framed again in the context of the struggle, right? So it's like it's always getting like the framing is inherently like not a Sophianic framing that we're approaching the problem with, because we are assuming the inevitability of the struggle, which Bulgakov is very much questioning. Like he doesn't see that it's necessary. He says that is the condition we find ourselves in, but he doesn't see it as a necessary or inevitable condition.
And it's a curious question then, to what extent, if your sights are too small, we see the Chinese as members of the kingdom of death, and we're
right. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly right. Yeah. That's all kinds of like. It leads to all kinds of really questionable patterns of thought, and it's highly concerning. And I don't have any answers, but I just wanted to see if you had any ideas.
No, I mean, people ask me questions about AI and stocks all the time. That's not what I research, so.
Right, I get it.
But it's interesting,
yeah. Of course, they ask you about stocks,
Another topic or another application to economics that I thought of at the end here was a topic that's called Knightian uncertainty, or the distinction between risk and uncertainty, right? Mm-hmm. And so Frank Knight is an early, and it makes total sense that he's the person that's talking about this based on Bulgakov. He's in the early 20th century economist at University of Chicago. So a lot of the famous people that come out of Chicago, like Milton Friedman and George Stigler and to some degree Ronald Coase and James Buchanan, were all his students, right? Mm-hmm. And but he is also a huge reader of William James and of Max Weber, right? So he has this book called Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, where he's basically trying to say, when you're making a choice under uncertainty, you can sort of have a rough generalization. There's a 50% chance that if I enter into this business, it'll succeed, 50% chance it'll fail. Or a better example would be something like, if there's a 1% chance that there's going to be a complete freak accident fire in this building and a 99% chance that it won't. So when I make business decisions, that are dependent on these future events, I can use probabilities to some degree to try to estimate how likely certain decisions are. And I can weigh different decisions against each other based on these probabilities, right? And then also, to the degree that I can characterize the world through probabilities, I could get an insurance policy, say, on that house. And that's to the degree to which I can assess these probabilities and other people can assess those probabilities, the insurance actuary, right? So to the degree that the world can be understood through regularities such that I can generate probability distributions for certain events in the future, an insurance company is willing to write an insurance policy for me. But there's certain kinds of activities, or there's certain kinds of things which are singular events, right? Or they're events that have so much uncertainty surrounding them, or so many other variables surrounding them that I can't fit in one head, or he even suggests are fundamentally, that have elements of fundamental chance to them, right? The universe is not deterministic, so there is some residual that we can't even characterize with probability. This is a situation he calls uncertainty, where I don't know the future and I can't generate a probability distribution, so no one's willing to write an insurance policy for me, right?
Right.
And so, but someone can still say, I know that I don't have a probability distribution for this, but I know this business is going to succeed, right? And bearing that uncertainty that you can't offload onto an insurance policy is what he says is the source in the market for the profit that we reward an entrepreneur with, right? So when someone enters into a business, they take on all the profit or all the loss, right? Because they're paying all their employees fixed wages, right? So they take on all the profits or all the loss, and that's because they have this insight about what they think the future is going to be that's not based on science or not based on the regularities of the past, right? And that's something that we pay them for. So in analogy to Bulgakov, that is, to the degree that we can have a business that we can have an insurance policy for, that's the extent to which science is effective. But beyond that, to answer further questions about the world, you'd have to access some other mental or metaphysical source. And Knight is a very strict anti-religious thinker. But you could say there's some other cognitive source of this knowledge about whether or not the future is going to work out in this way if I enter into the business in this way. And so in Bulgakov's world, Sophia provides a character to explain why those things occur, right? But Knight just says, well, Knight just needs to say that there is something occurring that is a special skill for which an entrepreneur is rewarded, is the idea.
Yeah.
Right. So it really all fits in nicely, I think.
Yeah, you can see in that in some of the things that Bulgakov says about the role of intuition in science and genius in chapter 5. You can see that reflected.
Have you read much Polanyi, like Luke Thompson?
I have read a little bit of Polanyi and a whole lot of Esther Meek.
Oh, okay. I don't know Esther. Oh, no. I've heard of her.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. But anyway, he's a little bit downstream from this stuff too.
Yeah.
And Israel Kirzner, who I've talked to Jacob Federecci about, because he's an economist that's building on these ideas, but he's also a Orthodox rabbi in Brooklyn.
Oh, okay. So, cool.
That's most of what I had, and then we'll have a lot of stuff next time, I think, too. So
yeah. So do we want to preview the topics of conversation for the next one? All right. So we're doing 5. We're doing 6, 7, 8.
I think we'll be able to do 9, but we'll talk about it later.
6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Because they're shorter chapters.
Okay. And then let me go to my table of contents here and kind of preview for the audience what the subjects will be. Here we go. Chapter 6 is called Economy as a Synthesis of Freedom and Necessity, which I almost got into. There's a little bit on freedom in this chapter, so it kind of naturally builds on here, on chapter 5. The Limits of Social Determinism is chapter 7. Chapter 8 is the Phenomenology of Economy, and chapter 9 is Economic Materialism as a Philosophy of Economy. So we hope to finish the book the next time in our 3rd and final episode. And thank you again for joining me, Marcus. I've enjoyed this conversation about philosophy of economy very much, and probably wouldn't have done it unless I had you to talk to. So thank you for that.
And this is great. So here at Eastern, one thing that we have to do as faculty members in our first few years is write a paper relating our discipline to faith in some way. So Bulgakov is going to probably be a very central part of it.
There you go. That's great. Yeah. Glad to have introduced you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me, Marcus.